Dr. Soufi, welcome to Story Connections. Such an honor to have you here. Uh, I'm so glad that we get to have this talk because we've talked about, chatting a bit about the work that you do and um, what I found interesting when I was researching some of the things that you've written is how it spans this vast. You cover the medieval tradition of Islam, and then you go into modern day traditions and talking about Canada, especially with your book Homegrown Radicals, and at its core you kind of explore how these ideas and conversations and different kind of conflicts shape our lives. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation. But before we dive in, I want to invite you to share a story, and we do this with all our interviews because it's a way for us to get to know you. So I would love for you to share a story from your own life. Was there a moment that kind of where you felt like a story changed how maybe you and other people think and feel? Was there a moment like that for you? It could be something, you've experienced personally as well, or something you heard or read.
There's been those moments in life where political events have really shaped the way I think about politics. They take me
Right.
down a new trajectory. For example, I mean, this book, Homegrown Radicals, it examines specifically the post 9/11 period.
Right.
And for me, I was 17 years old. I was in grade 12 when September 11th happened. And that was definitely a moment where world politics went in a different direction, but also my understanding of our world, my understanding of the West, my understanding of Muslims that live in the West.
Right.
So that was, a moment. I think the Obama years, not necessarily Obama's electoral win in 2008, but the years that followed, maybe I'd say like his Cairo speech, where he kind of affirmed that the U.S. was not at war with the Muslim world, that the U.S. respected the Muslim world, that there was space for Muslims within America, that there was
Right.
possibility of living in cooperation and solidarity with people in the Muslim world. I think that was also a moment where I started to rethink politics, and I think the uh, um, the recent genocide in Palestine, the post October 7th period, where we see a lot of Western governments who, for so long, have been talking about the importance of human rights, who have been talking about how whenever there's a population under threat, we need to mobilize to protect them, and yet they've, if anything, have given diplomatic cover to the genocide, to Israel, and to what it's doing. I think that's been an important moment for me in my thinking. And there's also moments of like intellectual growth, certain things that I've read, and suddenly I'm like, wow, I can't think of the world in the
Right.
same way again. So I remember just an example. I was in a third year undergraduate post colonial class in 2005, 2006. And my professor knew my interest in thinking about issues relating to the war on terror, the Muslim world. And he suggested this author named Tal El Asad, an anthropologist. I had never heard of him before.
Right.
And then I picked up his book, his latest book at that time, which was Formations of the Secular, which was really a critique of all of our assumptions here in the West about what religion is and what secularism is. And in the context of the post 9/11 world, it was an important critique of kind of our assumptions that the world would be a more peaceful place, would be a better place if we just secularize, if more
Mm,
populations of the world were secular, because religion leads to bigotry, religion leads to dogmatism and to violence. And in particular, like this kind of like we need to secularize the world was aimed at the Muslim world at the time. And he just like undoes all those assumptions. So that was a really important moment for me. I think Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue, which I read the following year, was also one of those very important moments intellectually in thinking about what is problematic about modern ethics in the Western world, what's lacking, and how in some ways there's a richer pre-modern tradition that we find not only in the Greeks but also in the Islamic world, and in the medieval Christian world too. And the years afterwards, I went to the University of Victoria and I studied under the guidance of a professor named James Tully, extremely well-known political theorist. And Jim Tully was really important in giving me guidance in terms of my understanding of a possible politics for the West that's inclusive, like a real democratic
right.
politics, What does that look like? Right. And I think in years since that time, people have a better sense of what that might look like. We're not executing it very well in our Western democracies, but they have a better sense of what it looks like. But back in like 2007, when I was studying with Jim Tully, it was the first that I was learning of it. And it opened
Right.
up different understandings for me. So I don't know about a single moment. And I know I'm not providing like a story that's particularly compelling, like a kind of aha moment, but there's been different moments throughout my life that have helped me see the world differently. And there's also moments like personal moments too, right? I've talked about
Right.
intellectual moments, I've talked about political moments, but there's also like, those moments like the birth of your child, the birth of my younger sister's 13 years younger. So I was 13 years old when she was born. And I feel like that was a moment where I realized there's so much more to life than just kind of thinking of oneself. And at 13 years of age, you're thinking about hanging out with friends, you're thinking about video games,
Right.
you're but suddenly now you see like, oh, there's this child that's in your family, and you're a big brother and you have certain responsibilities, and it helps you grow, like helps you realize that you're not alone in this world. This world doesn't revolve around you.
Right.
Take care of others, right? So things like that also. So that's a super long answer.
No, wait, so you just told me so many things that my brain was just like spinning. I want to ask so many follow-up questions, but I want to start with one thing. So let's go back to a political moment. You talked a bit about the Obama speech, the Cairo speech. I just wanted to ask you, because was that something you saw as a political stunt? Or was that something that you saw that genuinely changed the trajectory of how the West, wants to include Muslims within America and in just a broader sense, rather,
Yeah.
the West.
No, that's a great question. How about let's answer it this way. So my politics at the time, and I think it's still my politics today, is that the West large for the last 500, 600 years in different continents has been responsible for a lot of destruction, right?
Right.
So we can think about the Americas first, but then we can think about Africa and Asia, the period of colonization. For Africa and Asia, the 19th century is kind of the high point of that type of colonization. So if we want for those areas, we can talk about the last couple centuries. It's not a pretty picture, right? It's like if you look at the history, there's no way that you don't come out saying like, wow, there's a lot of harm that's been done there, right?
Hmm.
Forced starvations and massacres to subdue the population and forced labor, enslavement. It's an ugly picture. But here's the thing: when you have all the power, when you're the center of power, political power in the world, there's also opportunities for using that power in ways that might not be bad, right? And what I mean by that is like, think about how the best universities are in the US, right? It's the
Right.
center of global power, but the best universities are there. And it attracts people from all over the world. It attracts people from Africa. It attracts people from Asia. It attracts people from Latin America. They all gather there and they share ideas and they learn. And many of them decide to stay there. They decide to make
Right.
that their home, right? And they're now contributing to that society. And with those contributions comes the possibility of also thinking differently, right? Because it's very hard to think differently when you're insulated, when you're just kind of in your own bubble. But when you have people who are coming from all different corners of the world, and they're not just coming like to the US in this case, the example of universities,
Right.
to do labor. They're actually coming to think. Like oftentimes they're going to be registered in arts programs. Like Columbia University is a good example. Until recently, when through the Trump administration and the measures from their own presidents to kind of limit freedom of expression on campus, it was this kind of center where you had a lot of critical thinkers who were all like a lot of their origins. Most of the those critical thinkers, they came from the Arab world, they came from India, they came from Africa, right? So there's this kind of promise from empire of like, we've got so much wealth. We have all these institutions. Yes, we've done these horrible things, but people want to come here. And when
Right.
that happens, there's a possibility of, you hope that there's a possibility of change, that those people who come with new perspectives can say, hey, let's have a dialogue about some of the atrocities that have been committed. Let's have a dialogue about the fact that, you know, you claim that you want human rights, right? You've set up the UN. Let's actually implement those human rights. Let's
Right.
actually make the type of world that you think would be a good place. And if you've got blind spots, like let's say some of your human rights are a little Eurocentric, let's add to that conversation. We'll amend them a little bit, but we'll create some sort of norms that work for everybody. So there's this kind of promise in empire. And I think during the Obama years, what I saw, and it mattered that Obama, like his dad was from Kenya, he had spent time in Malaysia. There was a way in which, even though he had these deep American roots, and I emphasize that because we all know people wanted to say, like, oh, he was foreign to America, he was African, he was Muslim, right, etc.
Right.
He had these deep American roots, both in terms of his you know, his mom's side, but regardless of that, because that's not the basis of citizenship in the US, but also in terms of like his education and the way that he thought you felt very well at ease in American culture.
Right.
But nonetheless, like he had a certain perspective that was different. So I don't think that's a coincidence that his speeches kind of showed a possibility of a different America, right? Like one of the things that his speeches would emphasize, this isn't the Cairo speech, is and this he talked about at the anniversary of the Selma March, during the civil rights movement. He said like America is not just something that we celebrate. It's not just something we glorify. It's a work in progress. So when America screws up, we can admit it and we can try to work towards something better, right? And it's a bit of the same thing with the Cairo speech. I didn't give much credibility to Obama when he was on the electoral campaign, and a lot of Muslims, a lot of people of color, they were all like, "Oh yeah, man, this guy's a new type of president. He's going to be amazing." I was very cynical. Then I heard the Cairo speech, and I said, "Okay, maybe there's something here." The Cairo
Right.
speech essentially was a type of so Obama goes to Cairo. He goes to Al Azhar, which is like the preeminent Sunni center of scholarship in the Muslim world, and in front of all these representatives of like Egyptian society, not only political elites but also religious elites. He's quoting from the Quran. He's making all these claims about how, you know, Muslims have contributed to America. We're not at war with Islam, which, you know, it was a different tone than what you heard from Bush, who, even if right after 9/11 Bush was like, oh no, we're not at war with the Muslims, he would always kind of flirt with that idea, right? He would talk about a
Right.
fascist, which gave the impression that like, oh, there's this current in among the Muslims, and therefore you can't really trust them. Right? Whereas Obama always like he was careful not to use that language because he didn't want people to associate any type of extremism
Right.
with legitimate religion. So he kind of used that as a separation, like we're not even going to use that language. Now the thing is that so that was an important moment for me because I was like, okay, yeah, empire has done horrible things, but eventually we're going to get somewhere better, right? We're building something better. All this work from these academics who work on questions of multiculturalism, who work on critical race theory, who work on gender theory, whatever, who work on these critical sciences, we're going to get somewhere, right? Unfortunately, from this vantage point now, several years after the Obama administration, seeing not just kind of the pushback from like kind of like nativist Americans, like the Trump movement, right? But also the fact that during the Obama years, very little was done to change course. Empire was still empire. The drone attacks were still like horrific. They were still like killing innocent people in places like Afghanistan and in Pakistan, just to give examples, but Yemen too, and other places. So you know, the assessment of like, okay, you had pretty language, but the assessment of the actual presidency is kind of lackluster. And then even the language gets a pushback, right? There's this whole like anti-woke movement,
Right.
right? And this like language of like Trump, who is at times kind of very sympathetic to people who are like, there's too many people of color, right? It's not usually articulated in that language. It's more like, oh, the immigrants are rapists and whatever,
Right.
what he said
Yeah.
about Mexicans, and now what he's doing to immigrants in the US under claims of like they've broken the law, but we know that many of them being rounded up have not, right? So the assessment has now changed, right? That coupled with this genocide in Palestine, it's I have much less faith in empire. So I've gone through different phases, right? I think if you had asked me right after 9/11, I would have been very cynical about like the West as like a guiding light in the world. I saw like an opening. Maybe we can, maybe together we can work towards something. And now I'm very cynical again. But I do think like there's a moment of truth that's happening right now, because there's a lot of people who are seeing like emaciated children, people starving, and they're not cool with it. And if that movement can actually make gains, like if we have a similar thing to like a George Floyd moment, right? Not saying that everything's been solved with police brutality, but something in mass consciousness changed with the George Floyd, with the suddenly BLM that had been like trending with a large portion of the population, but never really piercing through to the mainstream. Suddenly now it was mainstream. If we can do that with the starvation and the genocide in Palestine, then maybe what I'm saying about creating a different West, creating a different future for like empire,
Mhm.
right? No longer an evil empire, but like one that's works for cooperation. Maybe something can happen, but it's not looking pretty right now. It's really not looking pretty, and it's not just Palestine, right? It's like these ICE raids. It's a pushback against that pluralism that I talked about. It's more like a return to like, well, I don't like those perspectives of
Yeah.
African and Asian and Arab thinkers at Columbia. Let's gut Columbia's fund. You know what I mean? So it's not looking good right now.
Well, I mean, that's such an important point that you make because, and the reason why I kind of asked you about that speech and kind of your perspective on that is it's almost curious, or rather my curiosity to know, is America with, or is America waging a war against the Muslim world right now? Because if you think about Iran, if you think about Palestine, if you think about Afghanistan, all these countries that, and within America itself, big population, or like a big fraction of America's population is Muslim, and so, and especially their immigrant population. So how, you said words were one thing, but actions were something else.
Mhm.
What do we see today? Are they at war? And what is your perspective on that?
No, I don't think they are. And the reason I say that is because colonial powers have never, just for the sake of it, wanted to subjugate a population.
Right.
It's always based off of particular interests, whether economic, geopolitical. There's a certain concrete goal. But what ends up happening is that for the sake of whatever goal they put in mind. So let's say for the war on terror, for the sake of getting rid of bin Laden and getting rid of regimes like Saddam Hussein's that are not favorable to the West, they are going to justify the dehumanization of populations whose skin color, culture, religion are different than
Mm,
yours. And so what ends up happening is there's a kind of like ends justifies the means. That's what I would say happens. And in a way that like, I got a question at Queen's University where somebody said like, well, in war there's collateral damage, right? And I said, yeah, but like think about it. Let's say that, the political aims of the US were directed towards the UK. Would we tolerate, us here in the West, images of like people in the UK being bombed, right? At a wedding party?
right.
Would we tolerate the evacuation, like the destruction of whole cities, like let's say Leeds or Cardiff gets completely destroyed? What would be our visceral reaction? We'd be like, what's
Right.
going on? You can achieve your political goals in different ways, not through bombing, not through gunboat diplomacy. So that's kind of the point here, is that like it's not so much that there's a war against the Muslim world. It's that when people are seen as foreign and they're dehumanized, then the loss of that life is just kind of subsumed under like, it's not good, but we had to do it, right?
Right. And I like that. I like what you said there because it's a contradiction, right? Because a attack on Paris is more viral than perhaps a attack on Gaza. So I think that's a beautiful way that you put that in, and then it just shows that contradiction. And I like how you said it's a matter of the ends justify the means. So that's I like that perspective.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're totally
Yeah.
right about the Paris thing. That was like pointed out during the, I think specifically after Istanbul had been targeted
Hmm.
by an ISIS attack.
Right.
So it was like, hey, where's kind of your solidarity
Yeah.
when it's
Exactly. No, that's, I mean, such a great thing to think about. I'm curious kind of to know what what first drew you to studying Islamic legal history on the one hand, and then you've turned to modern Islam and state power on the other? Was there like a turning point where these two kind of seemingly different paths verged for you?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's kind of funny because like if you want to study modern power, you want to study colonialism, you want to
Right.
study the contemporary Muslim world, you do a PhD in those topics, right? And for a reason or another, I was like, I'm interested in that. That's really what gets me going. Like I'm
Yeah.
interested in, what Obama is doing. So let's say I started my PhD in 2010. So what's going on in 2010? Let's say well, a few months later, the Arab Spring happened, right? So I'm actually more interested in the Arab Spring than I am in, say, like 10th century debates among what we call Muslim jurists, fuqaha, people who read the Quran, read statements of the Prophet Muhammad, and derive rules for Muslim society at that time. I'm actually more interested in the contemporary world. But you know what it was? It was that there's a way in which reading stuff on the contemporary world, this is how I thought about it at the time. Maybe I'm mistaken because I'm certainly not an authority now. Like, if I wanted to write about the history of modern Iraq, or, well, actually, I could probably do that. I'm certainly not writing about that as much as I would if I had done a PhD in that field. But the way I was thinking about it at that time was like, religion does matter to these societies. It matters not in a way of like religion is the explanatory variable for everything. That's like foolish to think like that.
Right.
But it does matter. Like religion is an important variable. And it seems the West, including a lot of political scientists at the time, things have gotten better, get it wrong or have a very shallow understanding of religion. So I was like, why don't I study this religion like in depth? Why don't I go back to these formative texts that inform the present, not in a kind of like, this idea that Muslims don't change with time. That's always perilous, right? You could assume that what somebody says in the 10th century still holds the same for the 21st century. That's not it. But just in terms of understanding kind of the complexity of this tradition and how it evolved and manifests in the present. And that's what that PhD allowed me to do. And I published, because he worked so long on a PhD, I published a book based off of my work at that time, and I thought it was useful. Like it was examining how Islamic law, contrary to the image of like kind of a dogmatic faith, it was incredibly open to dissent, right? To people arguing
Right.
like, no, the law isn't this because XYZ, and they would bring their arguments, and then the other person would be like, no, it is this way, right? And so I thought it was useful also to share those findings with people. But my heart's always been in the contemporary moment, like from the get go. Like when I did my
Right.
undergraduate, when I did my master's degree, I was always concerned about contemporary questions of colonialism, of violence, of imperialism. And the antidote, the possibility of like coexistence, solidarity, forging a better world, forging a better political community. So that's always where my heart's been at. And there's a way in which like this book has been an opportunity to pivot to the contemporary moment. And from here on end, like my focus is going to be more on the contemporary moment. I am thinking of writing a book kind of explaining the Sharia to a lay audience, because that first book is super dense. It's really for an expert in the field. So I'm thinking of writing something that would be a little bit straightforward. But it would really, I think in this case, even more than what I tried to do with the first book, it would be clearly to engage with debates, in the contemporary moment, whether in Muslim communities, because I feel like Muslims don't necessarily know how complex their tradition is and how open it was to debate, or in kind of like these Western circles where we hear less about it now, but this apprehension of like, oh, creeping Sharia, like these Muslims are coming and they're going to impose their religion on us, right? So yeah, I'm really focused on the contemporary period right now.
Well, I just have two thoughts to add to that because I think a book about kind of like exploring the ideas and ideals of Sharia law, it would be wonderful. Because I have grown up with a diverse community of people coming from different kinds of Muslim backgrounds. And when we talked about Sharia law, it was never with someone who was Muslim. It was someone who was non-Muslim. And I've always had these experiences where there's a lot of misunderstanding about Sharia law. And then I would love to see a book that that really explains, like you said, the democracy of it all and the ability to have those conversations. So that would be, first of all, beautiful. But second, you mentioned something about an antidote, talking about how we can talk about contemporary issues and then find ways that we can improve communities and societies. So I want to come back to not come back, rather actually shift focus to homegrown radicals, because on the surface it's about, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's about three Muslim students who disappeared, from a prairie town in 2007. But your telling kind of goes a bit deeper than the headlines that surrounded it, and it delves into the humanity of these young men and the communities around them. What made it so important for you to tell this story?
I wanted to do a few things with this book. First, I don't think that there was any really good account of what it meant to quote unquote become radicalized as like a young North American Muslim. I think most radicalization studies works were interested in kind of isolating those variables that would help security agencies determine, okay, who's out there in the Muslim community that could be a threat to us, right? So it's very state focused. It's right. It's like telling the state, telling the Canadian security agencies, American security agencies, what should you be on the lookout for? And at best, like maybe by identifying those variables, they could help through like at best, I say like they could help like Muslim communities identify within their own ranks people who they may need to talk to make sure they don't go down a dangerous path, right? At worst, they're like targeting those youth in ways that are going to ruin their lives, right?
Right.
That I document some of that in the book. But if you go down the route of like, let's give information to the state, you're missing out on like a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like the
Hmm.
people doing that work, for instance, we just talked about how I spent like several years researching the traditional, the classical legal tradition, like the Sharia, right?
Right.
But if you're like focused on like identifying variables, these are usually they're white experts and they don't have, and even if they're not, like they don't have a great depth of the Arabic language, which is the language of the classical tradition. It's still like the language of Muslim practice, like prayer. They don't have that depth. They don't have a real sense of texts that have shaped Muslim thought relating to war and peace. And again, it's not to say that the past is exactly the present, but they inform the present, right?
Of
Um,
course, yeah.
and in the book, I show how like there's also like ruptures, there's breaks with the past, but
Right.
the point is you still want to understand like the past to be able to understand the present. So they can't really grapple with ideology. They can't really grapple with theory, with like what is compelling, what are the ideas of these young men subscribe to.
Hmm.
There's going to be a pretty shallow account of what it is if you don't have kind of an understanding of the genealogical roots of those ideas, right? The historical background. And the second thing is you're not going to have a good sense of what was compelling. Why did the ideas around what we call jihadist ideas
Right.
about picking up a gun and fighting against the US during the war on
Right.
terror, why would that be compelling? Like, why would that convince somebody? You're not going to get that. What you're going to get is things like young men who feel isolated are going to find a community online, and that makes them more vulnerable. Or you're going to find something like young men who come from abroad and are new to Canada may feel like they can't fit in, and therefore they're going to try to find ways to fit in by joining,
Right.
a radical, or they've joined a certain branch of Islam called Salafi Islam, which might get them exposed to what we call a subdivision of that branch, Salafi jihadism. So that might lead them down that route, right? So it doesn't really tell you like, okay, yeah, that might lead them down that route, but like, why would they become convinced? Like, what about, so they've been exposed to those ideas. I've been exposed to a lot of ideas. I've been exposed to Nazi ideas. I don't find that compelling, right? Like, why did they find it interesting, or like, why did it influence them? And so I tried to do that. Like, I tried to do that by explaining a broader context. And I think part of the reason they can't do that too. So part of it is that expertise in Arabic and the Islamic tradition. But the other part is that if you go down that route, you're starting to do something that was like forbidden in the post 9/11 era. It's permissible now, but it wasn't allowed in the media, which is that you look in the mirror, you turn the gaze back at yourself being like the West here, Canada, the US. Because if you're asking like why was it compelling, then the answer brings in like your own actions too. Like why do they want to fight you? I don't know if you remember seeing clips of this, but like back then after 9/11 and for years, the kind of like why would they want to specifically target the West was a lot of very odd explanations, like they hate our freedoms, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Or like they want 72 virgins in paradise, right? It was like kind of like,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
that seems odd, but that's your full explanation. But like if you now are saying, okay, what was compelling about their ideas, and you really look at it, sorry, compelling about the theory of jihad that they subscribe to, and you really look at it, inevitably our foreign policy, the Canada's foreign policy, the US's foreign policy enters into the picture, right? And that starts to be all like you feel like you're kind of also blaming yourself. You can blame them, but you're also saying like we screwed up too. So that's something that you didn't want to do when you were in the middle of that war, right? When you're like fighting the Taliban, trying to consolidate your grip on Afghanistan, on Iraq. You don't want to go around and be all like, well, maybe we did some stuff we shouldn't have done too, right? But that's actually it. Like when you look at the full explanation, I'll give you an interesting bit of information. For several years after 9/11, there was not this phenomenon of the homegrown radical, right? If you
Right.
look at Canada, it's only with the Toronto 18 case, like 2005, that this phenomenon of the homegrown radical comes about.
Wow.
In other words, like you have to think, oh, this is like a product of the war on terror. It's not something that
Mm.
predates it, right? Bin Laden or whatever group overseas that may have declared war with the United States, that didn't resonate with Muslims in the US, the UK, Canada
Right.
until several years later. And you have to ask yourself why? Like what happened? Right? And a big part of the explanation is that they felt like we're seeing people being killed every day on the news. We know what's happening, and our own countries are partaking in it, and we want it to end. And then they heard a preacher. This guy was called as Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen who, after 9/11, wanted to work with the U.S. to emphasize a positive image of Islam, a moderate image of Islam, right? But a few years later, turned against the U.S. This guy comes up with a theory of fighting against the U.S. of jihad that convinces a lot of North American and Anglophone Muslims. I mean, overall, it's a super small percentage, like 0.01 or something of Muslims that he convinces. But nonetheless, that's enough to like create the phenomenon of a homegrown radical. And it doesn't happen
Right.
for him. It just doesn't happen. He's able to construct this theory that the U.S. is that the problem of the war on terror can be addressed. That Muslims can end the war on terror if they take up arms. He presents a case for that across 5 or 6 lectures. And for these 3 men that I examine in this book, they found that very compelling, and that's what led them down that road. Not the fact that one of them was newly converted, or the fact that another was a Salafi, or that another had didn't fit in Canadian society. Whatever importance those variables were in kind of like exposing them to this guy's ideas were compelling to those 3 men because they were seeing violence every day against people in Afghanistan, people in Iraq, people in Somalia, soon in Yemen, and they were like, this guy's making points that make sense to me, right?
Right.
We got to take up arms, right? And it's not an entirely secular thing, right? Like our religion commands us, they would say, to defend these people who are being bombed and occupied, etc. So it
Yeah.
has a religious dimension, but we can also understand it in very like universal terms, that like they feel that there is injustice, and they feel that there's a solution to that injustice by taking up arms. They are now convinced by this Anwar al-Awlaki, this theorist, and they leave. Right. So part of what I wanted to do with Homegrown Radicals is to move away from this kind of language that obscures the responsibility and the role of the state, right, of the US, of Canada. I wanted them to be part of the story. I wanted them to be part of the equation. At the end of the day, if Canada and the US still wants to say, well, these guys are monsters for believing this theory that picking up arms is justified,
Right.
fine, but admit your role in it. Admit that they would have never gone if you hadn't decided to occupy Afghanistan, if you hadn't decided to invade Iraq, if you hadn't decided to do drone campaigns in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, right? They would have never gone. Just admit
Right.
that part. Instead of being all like, well, they hate our freedoms. Well, they felt isolated, right? Just admit that it's a complex a political situation and that you're an actor in that complex political situation, and reflect in the future, even if you think you still have the moral high ground, reflect in the future when you decide, well, let's engage in a war to overthrow a dictator abroad, which is leads to a civil war and to a lot of people being killed, right? Just reflect on what you're doing, because if you can't take lessons from the past, if you can't see that what you did had some consequences that you didn't want to see happen, then you're not gonna learn, right? You're not gonna know what to change.
Yeah, well, and also it just sounds like Canada and countries like America, they do have the foundation and existing frameworks to address these issues in terms of if you think about truth and reconciliation, for example, a part of reconciliation has to be truth and accepting the truth and acknowledging it. And so I really like how you kind of frame that in terms of we need to look inside and then take responsibility before we start pointing fingers and before we do that. And that's such a beautiful way to put that. I want to go into a bit into the life of these people because and I don't want you to give away too much of the book because I think it's such an important thing that people read this. But for those who haven't yet, like can you take us a bit into their world and what was life like for them before their disappearance?
Yeah, absolutely. To go back to your last question, part of what I also wanted to do was to uh, give a sense of what it was to be a Muslim Canadian community living through the war on terror. And so by telling their story, like I start their story before their quote unquote radicalization, right? What their lives were actually like, from a perspective of almost any citizen in Winnipeg, where their city was, they led really exemplary lives, like, before they left. Like, one of them had a checkered past, right? He had these run-ins with the law, but he had changed his ways. He had
Mm,
become religious, and all three of them, since that person had become religious, all three of them were known to like volunteer their time for their communities, and not just Muslim community. Like, they were people who would volunteer within their university community, that would help people out in general. I gathered stories of them showing great generosity, them like lending a helping hand. They were also
right.
known to just be like friendly people. One of them had this really goofy personality, like really just kind of cheerful, and everybody just loved being around him. Another one wasn't goofy, but he had this like kind of like really respectable decorum.
Mm,
Like, whenever he would speak, he was like a natural leader, because whenever he would speak, people would see that like there was a certain sincerity, a certain thoughtfulness, a
right.
certain care to the words that he would impart upon others, that he would speak. And so they were actually really beloved by their community. And that's a big part of the story here, right? Is that their community, they were an intrinsic part of their community, and their community embraced them and showed them respect and care. And then in 2007, they disappear, right? And when they disappear, this Muslim community knows, it sees very quickly, right? Very
Right.
quickly, that any type of association with the men means a suspicion from the state. So security agencies, the RCMP, but mostly for this case, mostly ceases. Any type of association, they start to think, oh, you knew those guys. Well, maybe you think like them. Maybe you guys have colluded in some way. Maybe you guys stayed in Winnipeg and you're planning something, you're plotting something. They left, right? It was determined that they had left for Pakistan. They left, but maybe you guys are still plotting something, or maybe you're still in contact with them. So their families, who were like, crestfallen, they were so sad that their loved ones had disappeared, and they didn't even know what they were up to, right? They just reported them as missing. They thought that our police force, our state would help them.
Right. Yeah.
When you give a missing persons report, you want help, but they
That's the
start.
assumption. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the assumption.
Yeah.
But they come under the microscope. Like, one of them
Right.
loses their job, right? because now their security clearance won't work. Many of them like can't go to the US where they have family members anymore because our security agencies transmit to the US that like, oh, this family might be shady. We don't know.
Right.
So everybody sees right away that like if you know these people and you could be in trouble. And then this kind of distancing performance starts to occur within the Muslim community, right? They don't want to talk about it. When I say they, I mean like leadership in different mosques in Winnipeg. They don't want to talk about it. Um, People who knew them want to be all like, oh, I didn't really know them. They would come from time to time to the mosque, but I didn't really know them. And one of the questions that I ask in the book is, what happens when you're not able as a whole community to deal with something so heavy? Like three of your members have disappeared, and God knows they could be doing something illegal. They could be dead. You don't have the details, but you know something has happened, and their families need support. Right, their families have lost their loved ones, and their
Right.
friends need support, emotional support, but also they need support because security agencies are coming knocking at their doors,
Absolutely.
and they're young and they're vulnerable, and some of them don't have their own families here because they're international students. But you as a community, you're like, I can't do anything. If I do anything, then those security agencies are going to come knocking at my door.
Right.
And so there's this kind of like sense of abandonment. There's a lot of pain from this story, right? Still today, there's pain from the family members, pain from friends, pain that has not been dealt with. And there's a type of like collective grief that the Muslim community has never been able to deal with. So that's part of what I wanted to show too through this book is like what happens to a Muslim community. And the two things, to summarize what I just said, the two things that we see is like an inability to grieve and a need to kind of like distance yourself from the
Right.
radical. And the second is the constant kind of scrutiny from the state. And I mentioned one of them losing their jobs. I mentioned not being able to travel to the US. There's a lot of frightening stories that I dig up in the book, right? Like, and done to young kids, like kids, meaning like
Right.
adults, but like, undergrads without much, like pretty vulnerable.
Hmm.
The security agencies, CSIS is who I look at here, but we know the RCMP did some shady stuff too.
Right.
But in this case, I look at CSIS. They don't have much to be proud of.
That's sad. And throughout the writing process, I imagine it was not an easy process gathering people's stories. But the book has been out for a while now, and what kind of feedback have you kind of heard from readers or families? And what's the kind of was there like a really powerful reaction that kind of stood out to you?
So I don't want to speak for the families because I haven't been in contact with them. I did have a chance to, for the book, interview some members of some families, but I don't know where they stand on the book. And I think one of the reasons I've heard from people who have been in contact with them, I think one of the reasons is it's still a sensitive topic for them, right?
It's raw, it's fresh.
Yeah, exactly. People are still like in therapy, they're still processing what happened.
Right.
And so I don't want to speak for the families, but I have had a chance to be in a lot of Muslim communities, and almost by happenstance because I didn't like go to mosques to do like book launches. I went to universities, but a lot of the pros or the people that came to listen were Muslims, and it's been really well received, and it's been an occasion for a lot of them to feel like stuff that they've had to deal with is now being talked about out in the open. Like when I talked about like, this grief that they weren't able to express.
Yeah.
They weren't able to grieve, right?
Right.
They're feeling like, like, oh, I could talk to somebody in Toronto and they could be all like, that happened to me too, right? Like, but nobody talked about it, right? Because we were all afraid. We were afraid that if we talked about it in the media, then we'd be tarnished as like a terrorist or a terrorist supporter, and our names would be out there. We were afraid that if we talked about it, then CSIS would come even more, right? And so a lot of them feel like, okay, this is like an opening for the first time, an opportunity to revisit what was like really hard
Right.
years for a lot of us, and to say like, I'm not alone, I wasn't alone, and it's not okay. Like what happened was not okay. And now it's documented. Like there's this book now that says like, this is how CSIS conducted themselves, and it wasn't okay. And there's very few Canadians that reading that chapter would say like, yeah, that's the best way to keep Canada safe.
Right.
So that's kind of been the reaction. I remember one Muslim academic PhD student saying like, you know, so many of our stories haven't been told, and like this is like really important for that reason. So that's kind of been the reaction that I've been getting from people.
And that's beautiful because what you've done is through your story, you've created space for others to reflect and share and have their own space to be able to resonate with that. And that's so powerful. And in that same vein, you've kind of written about and we talked a little bit about this, but how post 9/11 security policies have blurred the line, between what it means to be a moderate and radical Muslim. So what is it actually, and this is purely out of for my curiosity, but what does it actually mean to be a radical? How do you define that term?
That's the problem. That's the problem.
Right.
It's a slippery concept. It's not one
Hmm.
that is very clear. I think that one of our big problems when we think about Islamophobia
Right.
is that the post 9/11 world set up this division between the radical Muslim and the moderate Muslim. And you can go back to George W. Bush's speech, State of the Union address shortly after 9/11. You can go back to Jean Chrétien's speech in the House of Commons. And what you find is this kind of like, there's these Muslims who have a radical interpretation of their faith, and they are the enemy. And then there's the moderate Muslims, and they live among us, and there are allies throughout the Muslim world, and don't attack them. They're good. Don't round them up for internment camps. Don't deport them. Don't
Right.
bomb those countries. They're important. They're good people.
Right.
And for a lot of Muslims, like right after 9/11, that was a godsend, right? Like, thank you. Yeah, we're not going to go to internment camps. Thank you. Yeah, we're not going to bomb all Muslim countries. That's great. I love that idea, right? What they didn't realize was that, like, George Bush saying this or Jean Chrétien saying this, these are not theologians. They're not producing a definition. There's no like clear symbol of like, okay, so who's the radical? Obviously,
Right.
obviously, there's a way in which the listener would say, well, Bin Laden, that's the radical. Okay, but the war on terror didn't just target Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, right? It went after a lot of groups and in a lot of countries, right? So, and it didn't round up like card carrying members of Al Qaeda in Canada and the US. People who were targeted were like, how do you identify people who have sympathies with this radical Islam, right? All those things were left open. And so
Right.
what that means is that like as the years went on, security agencies were making guesses. I remember, I brought up the group Salafis, right? And I remember hearing a story that in the months after September the 11th, security agencies had heard like Bin Laden was a Salafi, and then they had heard that some two random guys at a mosque were Salafis, and they just rounded them up, right?
Right. Yeah.
So there wasn't this like real sense of like we understand who the radical is. And what that ends up doing is a lot of people who are just trying to lead their lives can be rounded up by security agencies or can be tarnished by in the public sphere
Right.
by Islamophobes, right?
Just casting a wide net.
Exactly, right?
Right.
So let's say somebody doesn't like that there is a preacher who's saying that some Muslim women in Quebec should be able to wear a veil when they are teaching, right? Let's say somebody doesn't like that. They can say, "Well, that's radical."
Right.
Well, is that
Right.
is that the same thing as Bin Laden?
Yeah. Where do we draw the line? Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Then that's why it's blurry, right? So you just lump them in with like this category of radical. And of course, nobody wants radicals in Canada, right? So now it becomes a justification to prevent women from wearing the headscarf when they are teachers, right? In Quebec, which is now a huge problem, or in France in general, in schools in France. So that's kind of what I mean about the blurring of the line between the radical
Right.
and the moderate. It's a pretty consistent thing since 9/11 that's how Islamophobia functions. You hear like Islamophobes will go online or will speak in speeches, and the move that they make is to cast a wider net, right? They'll say like, we all agree that there's crazy Muslims out there. Look, Bin Laden, look, the Taliban, they're crazy Muslims.
Right.
Well, guess what? Most Muslims are crazy Muslims. The only ones who are not are secular Muslims, right? So they might draw the
Yeah.
line at different places. The point is that it's like, is the rhetorical strategy is to start off with like, we all agree there's the radicals out there, but guess what, right? It's that kind of guess what?
Right.
There's more
Yeah.
radicals than you assumed, right? So Yeah, that's what I try to show in the book. And what I show in the book too is that it's not always like blatant Islamophobes. Like it played out in a trial of one of the three men. So one of the three men was put on trial eventually, and it played out in one of his trial where it was kind of like at crucial times, things that relating to the Islamic tradition that were innocuous or that could be innocuous were just labeled as like nefarious. And that's a way to tell the jury, like convict him. Look, he's a radical, right? So yeah, it can play out in ways where it's not an obvious like Islamophobe. It can just be the state who wants to achieve something, right?
Well, it also goes to this idea of like what you fear the most is what you don't understand. And that's yeah, and that idea is definitely harmful. So I wanted to ask you when it comes to because let's talk a bit about this idea of radicalization, but who bears the ultimate responsibility from protecting people or from radicalization? And what I mean by that is we've talked a little bit about how we need to do a lot of inward reflection in terms of our responsibility as the West, in terms of what we have achieved in making radicalization possible, right? So where does your work contribute to that conversation? And who bears that ultimate responsibility for making sure that those lines aren't as blurry and we're taking responsibility?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think if I understood you correctly, part of the question is like, all right, yeah, we can look inwardsly, but obviously we don't want people to fly overseas and join a militant jihadist organization. So at the end of the day, what's the best way to stop that from happening? I mean, I guess my answer throughout the book, because I'm really interested in critiquing our state and not so much critiquing, like I feel like everybody critiques the jihadists, like well, nobody likes ISIS, so like what's the point in critiquing them?
Well, that's more than enough critiquing
Exactly,
in that
right?
aspect to go around. So,
Yeah, exactly. So I guess like what I focus on is more like, yeah, what can we do as a society to create a world where nobody feels like they need to pick up a gun to right wrongs? And what I feel is, they're legitimate wrongs, right? It's just how do you go about changing them? And what I highlight in the book is that like most Muslims from that 9/11 generation, they found other ways to fight back. They fought back through like the pen, they fought back through law, they fought back, right? Those types of ways. So so if you undercut the legitimate grievances, then you also undercut what would be compelling about those ideas. And I didn't mention this, but like that guy Anwar al-Awlaki, it's only after the state started surveilling him that he flipped on them, right? Like there would have never been a theory of jihad to fight the West,
right.
homegrown one, if they hadn't also surveilled him, right? So yeah, start by that. Start by like not creating a world where violence there's this feeling that you need to respond to injustice with violence, and then also like if you're not surveilling and alienating people, maybe they won't draw up theories that say that you're the enemy. But I think you're also bringing up the fact of like, okay, well, but we're in this situation where some Muslims might feel compelled to join a militant organization. What do you do? And that's the classic question of like radicalization studies. And I guess first I'd say, yeah, there is this strain of thought called counter violence extremism, CVE, where it's kind of like you work with communities to identify potential threats instead of like being the surveillance state. You empower communities to kind of direct their parish and direct their flock in ways that won't lead them down that road of radicalization. But there's also been critiques of that, right? It's still really invasive. So that's one way, but it has its problems. I think just to speak to our contemporary moment, because we could talk about it more abstractly, like kind of like what would we do removed from any particular instance. But right now, that guy Anwar al-Awlaki, he doesn't have much of a following, and the reason is that a lot of the Muslim leadership, like clerics or scholars within North America, who had like a similar approach to religion as this guy al-Awlaki, have spoken out against al-Awlaki and
Mm,
have warned their parish against listening to him. That coupled with the fact that the ISIS kind of we could call it an experiment, like this experiment of establishing a Muslim state through the
right.
was a spectacular failure, right? That Muslims saw like, oh, they're reenacting slavery against Yazidi women. They are, and they also they weren't able to keep hold of their state, right? I think that has gone a long way to make the idea of becoming a radical, of like going down that route, of radicalization a lot less appealing. The fact, but even more importantly, and this goes back to my first point, like the fact that there was a pullout of Afghanistan, Iraq, that also undercut kind of an impetus for radicalization. So I don't think we're at a point where it's is much of a threat. I think what is concerning right now, but it doesn't seem limited to Muslims, is the daily images coming out of Palestine definitely have quote unquote radicalized a lot of people in the sense of like they
Absolutely.
can't take it anymore, right? Like
Right.
when we see Aaron Bushnell over a year ago setting himself on fire, that's a radical response, right?
That is. Yeah.
It's different than picking up a gun and joining a militant organization, but there's a certain, like, right now when people, it's that same feeling of desperation when people are
Hmm.
desperate, when they see injustice, we don't know what's going to happen, right? And there have been, that act, that guy who was throwing Molotov cocktails at Jewish people in Boulder, Colorado. There have been acts, right? Radical acts. And but a lot of this stuff is not even predicated on religion right now. It's kind of like it's a mishmash of, people might be on the left, might be feeling just sickened, right? So yeah, so I think that's really the issue right now. But it's well, we're gonna have to just kind of see. We're gonna have to see where things head for Muslim communities in particular. I'm not seeing any indications of like a return to listening to El Awlaki, but we'll have to see.
That's an important thing to point out, that also there have been lessons learned from history, both for the Muslim community and for the West, and in terms of radicalization, and then how we treat and how we reconcile with our history. So I think there's definitely a lot to look out for in terms. But like you said, there's some difficult imagery that we're seeing right now with the situation in Gaza and Palestine, and that's definitely not helping people be able to, turn turn a blind eye onto the state of the world right now. I kind of like, just to wrap up, I wanted to ask you if there's a question, um, or no, not a question, but is there anything that you hope that readers should be asking themselves, after they've finished reading their books? Like, what is that message that you want them to take away?
Yeah, I think what I found most disheartening about our politics since I've been a late teenager and adult is how we kind of sell ourselves certain delusions. Like the war on terror we could have responded differently. You mentioned that
Absolutely.
recently, right?
Yeah.
And we felt like the only plausible response was kind of like, if you read some transcripts after September the 11th of our politicians in the House of Commons, there's kind of this consensus that, well, we got to go to war. Civilization's under attack. We got to now, you have all these people and thing on the right that look back 20 years ago and they're all like, that was stupid, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
hindsight is 2020, but the thing is, there were people back then, educated people, people who knew the Middle East, people who understood, the complex history of world politics, who were kind of like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, they were sounding the alarms, they were raising concerns. It
Yeah,
was all there. Yeah,
yeah, we
absolutely.
could have gone a different route. And the irony too is like, people like Anwar al-Awlaki, the Muslim community, those people at the time had like, they were like, guys, like we know these communities, we're attached to these communities. This is not the way to
Right.
go about. Like we have some
Yeah.
insights. Stop kind of like assuming that it's like we are the protectors of civilization, because that was the narrative, and we know what's best. And might is right. So and even within the House of Commons, there was an exception. Like the NDP's leader at the time said, like, guys, like there's a different way. We shouldn't be going through violence. But her voice was drowned out that day, right? Instead, it was like, this was Alexa McDonough. Instead, it was like all these white men, Chrétien, Gilles Duceppe from the Bloc Québécois, Stockwell Day, and the former Prime Minister, Joe Clark. Those four were kind of in unison, like, rah, rah, let's go to war, right?
Right.
Really that
Yeah,
attitude. And the woman, of course, she's the sensible one in the room, the leftist woman. She's like, guys, like, are you stupid? There's another way of going about here, right?
absolutely.
And she was
Yeah.
presenting actual facts. They were just like, civilization is under threat.
Right.
Democracy, we must preserve democracy, right? And it was, and now, but like now, like it's so interesting because you couldn't go on the news, and back then we also didn't have social media, so it was also unfortunate. Like it was really like this diluted public sphere. You couldn't go on the news and express these things, right? I talked to a friend who's a prof, and she had critiqued. She had gone to some conference in Ottawa and critiqued the idea of invading Afghanistan. She's a feminist scholar, like a gender studies scholar, and she got like all these public denunciations, death threats, like people just going after her
Right.
for having a different opinion. You couldn't have it at that time. We wanted to delude ourselves so that we could convince ourselves that war was the only way, right? And so it just frightens me the extent to which, as a society, we do that. And I think social media is a really good tool to like pierce through that because we see alternative narratives, we see experts weighing in. You know, that prof has a direct line through social media that she didn't have back then. Back then, it was, yeah, her story was just being told by, you know, whatever, the Globe and Mail or whatever it was, Ottawa Gazette. But now she would have a direct line to us. But still, like you still see this kind of collusion between media and politicians to kind of like oversimplify and sell us these stories. And it's always in what hurts me the most is it's in relation to questions of oftentimes of foreign policy where people get killed and it's not cool. And we're involved in these wars. And so I think that's what I'd like my reader to take away from this. Like, read the book and see, like, we had a different path. We could have gone in different trajectories than we did after 9/11. And the path that we did take was pretty ugly, right? Like, it dehumanized people overseas and we justified their deaths. And we got nothing from it either. I don't think it would have been justified even if you had created a better society out there, but you didn't. You ended up retreating, and the Taliban is back there. It's like you know that you spent those years for no reason at all. And in Iraq, a civil war ensued, and so you didn't create peace and harmony. Right, and in the meantime, like people died, and people of color died, and it's unjustifiable. So read the book, see that, and then see what it also did to Muslim communities. Because at the same time, you're all like, oh, those Muslim communities are suspect. They might not be loyal to Canada. And then they went through a lot of stuff. They went through a lot of hardships. So yeah, that's what I want them to take from it. And to next time around, when there's a war being sold, think deeply. Think about how something's being
Hmm.
sold to you in the name of some sort of nationalism and some sort of image of a civilization, right? Some sort of saving the West, whatever it is, and think that there may be another way forward that doesn't entail the loss of life.
That's such a beautiful message, and I think that it's so relevant. We are seeing that it is a war that's folding out in Gaza and in Palestine, and I think that a lot of us can take away a lot of good messages from your book in terms of rethinking how we approach certain things and and also being able to critique and call out people for the actions that they've taken. So I think that's a beautiful way to end things, and I thank you so much for sharing your journey, your stories, and for talking about such an important book that I think a lot of us need to read. And you know, it's a powerful story, and there's always that ability for a powerful story to move people and to inspire. So I think that is one thing that I would like to tell people is that if you want to be moved, that this is the book for you. Before we go, is there anything else that you would like to say, add? Where can people find your book?
Yeah, you can find it in a variety of ways. You can go to, if you have McNally Robinson in your area, you could go there. They carry it. Maybe your local, check with your local bookstore, but certainly you can also order it directly from the publisher. So if you're in Canada, which I think most of your listeners would be, you can order it from the University of Regina Press. University of Regina is the Canadian publisher. If you're in the US or international, you can order it through NYU Press, New York University Press. They're the primary publisher and they're the international publisher. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. Great talk.
Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too.